I think one of the recurring themes, questions that we've been exploring is what is the role of a venture capitalist, of an investor? I think we come to this from two different perspectives. You, having been on the operating side for a decade plus, and me on the investing side, but now we've formally joined forces, and we're working on new opportunities, on portfolio companies. So, what is the role of a venture capitalist?
First of all, thanks for having me. I think the one thing I just want to make sure everybody here is out the gate is there shouldn't be a side. We should all be on the same side, and we're one team. And I think teams go through ups and downs. We all have our favorite sports teams, and we've seen that happen in life. But we're all one team. So I think that's like the mindset I have going into this conversation. Since I'm talking and I get to go first because I'm talking here, what have you seen change in like 11, 12, 15 years of doing this?
Well, I'd say the first thing that's changed is me. My thinking has evolved and continues to evolve on this. During that time, I ended up having a son. He's 5.5 years old now. And I can't help but continue to draw parallels between a parent's role with their child. I really don't mean this in a patronizing way, but thinking about having a portfolio of companies makes me think a lot about having a portfolio of children or having a family. It's become really clear to me 10 years into this, because we have investments still from Fund One, that when you invest in a company, you're really marrying each other. And this could be a 10-year marriage. And as I think about like my approach to my marriage relative to having a portfolio of companies, it really crystallizes what you should be doing, what your role is. And similarly, like, what is your role once you have a child? You know, a long-winded way of saying I'm approaching being an investor in our companies much more like being a parent these days than I am what I thought was like the traditional, hey, we capital into this business, we help where we can at some point, and we're all gonna make a lot of money together. So there's a lot of detail to that, but I'd say my approach more and more these days is thinking about it like a marriage between a parent and a child. And I think we may differ on that.
Yeah, I think we might. I mean, characteristics you're alluding to have a lot of commonality between the two of us, which is, and maybe I should just be clear about where my position is. My position is that we're a team and we oscillate between being the coach, the student, and the teacher, right? A founder knows more about the product and the market at depth than I think I do at any given moment, because they live, breathe, and eat it. Whereas I'm spending a few hours airdropping in and out. There are things that I'm learning every day and I'm not good at. I have to be vulnerable enough to actually to ingest those items. That also requires a mindset of unconditional love and assuming positive intent the entire way, which is what you're alluding to in the characteristics of, I think, the child relationship. And I think founders, I think that's where I had the best experiences, is when they're continuing to teach me, and every call feels like it's helpful on both sides. And the reason why I gravitate slightly differently to the coach mindset versus the parent mindset is that, coaching ability, we're constantly going to work together. The mindset out the gate is, we're not family. We're here to get better at the thing we're both passionate about, whether that be a sport, whether that be a musical instrument or something else. And I think that's where I found, at least in my life, that those types of teachers I've had, including my music teacher, have been that formative force. So I think it also comes from my personal experience. Outside of my parents, my music teacher was probably the most formative force in ability to be more disciplined and have more integrity and everything.
And I'd say at the outset, we were always trying to be more Socratic in our approach with founders in all instances. Like, let's ask the right questions so that they can hopefully arrive at the conclusion. And that's not to say we knew what the right conclusion was, because like you said, oftentimes we're learning as much, if not more, from our founders than they are from us. As I think about having a son, there are times where a long leash is really good. Like, hey, let him go figure this out, get hurt, bump into something, fall off the swing set, etc. But there are also times as a parent where you will just say, I'm sorry, like, this is what you need to do. And so I'd say I've run into a lot of instances lately where, before I've kind of looked to be Socratic, I've thought about, well, is this a moment where I should be Socratic or prescriptive? And I've chosen to be way more prescriptive. Now, they may not respond well to that, like a rebellious child might not respond well to it. And then the other thing to think about as well, we invest at seed. Like, these companies and the teams and the founders mature over time, much like a child. And the way you interact with a 5-year-old is probably very different from the way you interact with a 15-year-old, the way you interact with a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old. Like they've now started to go through different life experiences as well. So I think there's a spectrum of what that parent child relationship looks like over time.
We're saying the same thing, but in using different lenses here. Like I think about a quarterback and a coach in a football team, and they are the most important assets to a $5+ billion enterprise, and it is trying to grow year over year. And a quarterback plays a pretty big role in the growth of that asset. An investment fund, we have coaches and we have high quality players, all of which require a great amount of rigor in getting them to do things that are probably unnatural to them. And I think that's the same way I feel about my 3-year-old child. There are some things that are unnatural to him, but he needs to do. Like, for example, potty training just needs to happen. And reality is, if I look at like the coaches and quarterback relationships, think about Joe Montana and Bill Walsh, or Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. You see tons of friction constantly between these two high power, high motor individuals. And what they commonly have together is a North Star of probably being the best. And I think where I struggle is when I invest in a founder, I feel like they're an adult and they're ready to assume the responsibility. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to be the best at what we do. You're not really forming your basic skills. You're now forming your what could be life-changing money.
Mhm.
And that life-changing money requires my mindset to slightly shift a little bit for like, hey, this is not like your 0 to 18. This is your 25 to 40, which could be your entire life. You could do your entire life for 15 years and be done financially. And so do we. So what we're investing in is actually an asset that grow both the fund, but could also grow their own personal ability to earn over time and garner whatever public notoriety they want or financial notoriety, strength they want. Those quarterbacks need help that sometimes a coach can't provide. And so I think that's our job, is to, as they're a part of the roster, which is why I think about these companies, they're part of a roster. Like, are we getting them to the best possible quality in every single play where they can put together 4 quarters and win?
If I were to try to draw some distinction between how you and I look at it, one thing that I've been thinking about, because Andy and I will beat ourselves up about why things are not working better at some of our companies. As much as we'd like to like let go of those things, we never can. And it's become clear to me why. I've seen parents that have had really complicated relationships with children, but you never give up on a child. Like even really strained relationships, years of not talking, but then the parent does some little thing and you're like, well, they still haven't given up on that child. And I think about that with our companies, even, at times where they're frustrating me or I'm sure I'm frustrating them. I can't ever seem to give up on them. And maybe that's a weakness because I'm guessing there's funds out there that at some point say we're cutting our losses and let's move on. With a team, you can, on some level, kind of cut your losses or, Belichick can fire Brady. Obviously, there's going to be a big discussion about that. But like, how do you reconcile my belief that you can't ever ultimately give up on a company versus your model, which might allow you to?
The marriage concept is probably where we're most aligned. I mean, I know you can technically give up on your marriage too. The reality is, I think if you look at the intentions going into a marriage, it is for the most part to be there together forever. And I think that's where we have the most common ground. Now, I think the other thing we're also saying is, if you think about the similarities between a toddler, my wife, and a founder that I'm working with, and where there's most friction that probably drives the difficult times in any relationship, it's because there's conviction in their own belief. A toddler's conviction that they should be watching Bluey, instead of eating breakfast. Or a founder's conviction that, hey, you know what, I hear you, but I think this is the way we need to build a product to actually get the most users activated on the platform, is where I think we see friction. And I think that's the healthiest thing. That's capitalism at its finest, in my opinion. Both people have the goal of being at the best of something. And that conviction likely turns into friction. And that friction probably turns into the best results. And so what you're saying is actually like, how do you create the best environment where you can foster friction through conviction and still have the same North Star that we're working to still be together? through the process.
I mean, one place where rubber really meets the road in all of this is when companies come back to us, needing more capital. And that's a moment where I really think about, like, is the right move to just give money, or is that not actually what they need right?
Pulling on that thread even more is that difficult conversations need to happen earlier. The difficult conversations on their own is not the end point. And that's what I have personally experienced on when I've seen good and bad receiving end of venture money. Is it's not good enough to just say in a board meeting that, especially at seed stage, and frankly, Series A, B, probably C too, is like, well, this needs to get better. Okay, like that's not being helpful. It's like, here's how I've seen it be better. Here's a path, and I can put you in touch with an expert that's really good at that. That's what I've been a part of. And fundamentally, when I had the luxury and pleasure of working with Jerry Chen at Greylock, that's what we got at Blend, was great coaching and almost like, here are the steps that I would consider, and here are the milestones and checkpoints to measure. And let me give you an idea of how that's played out. Here are a couple speed bumps to be aware of. That foresight and helpfulness is, I think, the difference between good and great, both for companies and for venture funds.
I'm guessing, much like a parent, he figured and learned that the hard way through a lot of trial and error. And
Yeah, we've been to high school too, and so we know what freshman year is like. So yeah, we got to go back to the well to figure out to remember that. But that's where we could be most helpful to a child. That's also where we could be most helpful to our partners. When we're like, hey, if we prioritize that, here's that's going to have downstream effects to something else. And that's also, to your point of sugar, be ready for the back taxes. If you don't, if of the decisions you make. And I think that accountability is two ways with both ventures, funds, and operators.
Yep. I don't quite know how we wrap this up, but I am thinking of the instances where we're deeply engaged in rigorous conversation with our founders, and how that often leads to great outcomes. And then in other ones where we might be a bit lighter touch, and I'm sure they get off the phone and we get off the phone, and we're kind of sharing a bit more information with each other in private that really should have been the information that was shared on the call. And so, I'm trying to be a bit braver about saying the things that I am thinking while on the call, like I should be saying to my wife or my child, versus, bottling them up. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll ever be perfect in that, because it's also the nuance of the situation, how the individual on the other side is receiving information. But I think this goes back to, like, our conversation you and I constantly have, is it's about the people. It's about choosing the right people to invest in from day one, and being with them through this journey. And I think that's where, like, there's a slight difference. When your child is born, you don't get to choose their personality, et cetera. They're born into it, and you can shape it. But in this case, you get to select their personality and select who they are, and decide to go be married together, which is where the marriage concept, I think, aligns really well for us. And I think the way, in my opinion, maybe the best way to wrap this up is, like, going back to the most important thing at the center of this, which is that we are both people who have, like you've always said, have egos, have great conviction, have seen the world. How do you listen to each other consistently, balance the student and the teacher mindset, and align on the North Star, so that when you do have difficult conversations, you're constantly tied back to something more meaningful in that specific friction moment that you're in.
Yeah.
And choosing the right people to marry, as I've seen, is probably the biggest change you'll make in your adult life. It kind of drives everything.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why the old adage of happy wife, happy life exists, is because, like, it gives you the foundation to do great things. That's how I think about choosing. I think this concept of, you choose the right people and want to consistently work with them and go through the good times and bad times, magical things can happen. And you look back at it 75 on a beach in Italy, and you're like, you know what? This was great.
Yeah.